Our next guests need very little introduction. They worked during Atari's heyday, and they developed such games as Real Sports Baseball, Ported Defender, Quadrun, which is the first game to have a voice, Pele Soccer, and Canyon Bomber. We have Keithen Hayenga.
Right here.
There we go. Bob Polaro, Steve Woita, and Steve Wright, and of course David Crane.
Okay. Well, it seems like we should start in kind of chronological order.
You mean age before beauty?
Well, I may never get to talk then. So I'm in the last group. We started after everyone else going on.
I was there for 6 years. I was actually there when Atari first started being a year-round production. Prior to that, it was just a little Christmas run. And I started off in the LSI test area, got to know the seller chip and the LSI chip, and then moved around the company, became a game programmer, wrote a game, then became a manager of the whole video game department.
What did they do?
Just go around.
Yeah.
Well, I worked at Atari for 2 years, 77, 79, late 77, late 78. So that surprises people, I think. Working at Atari for 100 years? Is that what we're talking about? Some of the guys there?
Yeah, I started in 78, and I was there for 6 years. Started with the Atari 800 basic games, and then they had a number of products, so I got up to speed on the 2600. Games on that machine, and then went on after that.
These are waiting for me. So I left Apple because of this guy, Keith, and he got me an interview at Atari in about 82. I started in 82, left in 84. I didn't want to leave, but certain people bought the company and chose to make us leave.
So chronologically, I guess I was thinking that I had come later because most of these guys worked 2600, and so I actually worked on the 5200. So I'm one of the few people that did that. So originally, these guys got things started, and I was working at Apple Computer also, and Steve and I had this idea of how to put Atari joysticks onto an Apple computer. And we'd gone up to Serious Software and made a presentation to them that we wanted to have them sell this stuff. And of course, they came back with a different proposal. They wanted a different chunk of equipment, and they needed someone to write some software for it. So I'd written some software, 6502 assembly language stuff, that was a game. So I was already a computer gaming professional when these guys got, well, David gone off and Activision stuff and stuff like that. So I got to be like the second or third generation of programmers. So I thank you guys for getting us going.
And that's how basically, then you told them that I could write some stuff in Apple.
Steve begged me. He said anything to get me to work there.
So I got there and they wanted me to write 5200 stuff, which I was like, hey, this machine's not out there. And this is after they already hired me, and I want to write it on the 2600. And so that was an issue. I remember the manager, Don Kaiser, not too happy with that, just throwing the 2600 manuals down at the ground in front of me and said, okay, go ahead, whatever. And that was pretty much it. I just kind of got to do what I wanted there.
Yeah, but programming the 2600 cartridge is really a really interesting experience because what you have is one microprocessor and one graphics chip. That's it. That's the entire game. And the graphics chip is a custom LSI chip, what, 200,000 transistors back then. And what you're doing with the 6502 in assembly language is you're actually packing the registers one scan line at a time just in front of the TV raster. and then snap back to the next line, and you're shoveling data in there. You've got 64 machine cycles. I think it was.
76, so it's like 228 color blocks divided by 3.
Right. Yeah, so you got this exact number of machine cycles, and you have to use them all. And if the kernel that was writing the scan line came up like 2 machine cycles short, you have to throw in a no-op to burn up the extra machine cycles, so the microprocessor would stay in sync with the raster going across the screen. The machine was incredibly primitive, and the exercise was to do a lot with a little. So that was the real challenge of the 2600, was to do a lot with a little. It had 2 sprites, 1 ball, 1 play field. Those were the graphic elements in it.
Well, in fact, that weakness was its strength as well. When the chip was being designed, there was no such thing as a cartridge programmable video game. Actually, the Fairchild Channel F in the market, I think, before the 2600 short, but it wasn't on the market. And so, Atari had been making a lot of money selling these Pong machines and these standalone game systems, a little piece of plastic with some knobs on it, put a few keys, and it did one thing. And they said, all right, here's what we're going to do. We're going to make this game system, and we're going to make it cartridge programmable so that we can sell Tank and Pong the same music. So you're going to buy this thing, and you're going to get Tank, or you're going to get Pong, and then you get to buy Tank if you had Pong. So their intention was to make it cartridge programmable so they could sell those 2 games, because those were the 2 games it was designed to do. But at the time, silicon was very expensive, and the size of the custom LSI was very critical, and they really couldn't go any higher than 200,000 transistors and do it cost effectively. So what they did was they tasked a bunch of people to say, look, there's a lot of ROM up here, and we're running out of room in the silicon. So what I want you to do is figure out techniques of writing software in the ROM that lets us take hardware out of the chip. And so instead of having the ability to those 2 sprites I'm talking about, instead of being able to position them on the screen, you actually have to run a very complicated timing sequence and strobe the hardware at a specific moment, and then do a little correction after a little error correction, all that, just to move the friggin' thing, just to put it somewhere on the screen. And that was all done to save on the hardware. They said we could do it really simply if the software does most of the work. And they did that for a whole bunch of different aspects of the hardware, keeping it simple, keeping it very simple. Well, serendipitously, if you take all of this capability out of the hardware and put it in the software, and the software is the thing that changes every time you change the cartridge, you've got much more versatility. If you think about it, you've made the hardware so that it's much more dependent on the software, and that's the great part, because the hardware is sitting in grandma's house already, and it's the software that you're changing with each game. So the more limited the hardware was, it turns out the more versatile it was. And there's no doubt in my mind, the 2600, there might have been 15 games on the 2600 if they had put as much of the hardware that they wanted to put in the chip. They'd actually put it in there. Instead, they made it much more versatile.
I wanted to throw some more ammunition to that too. So as a 5200 programmer, I still have to say, one of the things that the 2600 had that I wasn't used to coming from the Apple II world, where their high-res color was black and white and purple and green. So the thing is that basic stuff that they had multiple colors, and so if on a particular scan line you actually switched the color palette or changed the registers, you got multiple colors. So for something that was so simple, it still had some great looks to it.
Yeah, that's great. But the Apple, you had a bitmap. We couldn't set those colors on every bit. We had to do it with this, the kernel. But it was not okay.
Yeah, the intended design was that in the vertical interval you would load the sprites with your red one and your blue one. And then the kernel would fill in the bitmap for the shape of it. What you had to do to get cagey was change the color of the sprite on every scan line in order to get a multicolored sprite. And the genius that he was talking about, the weakness of the limitation, was they had to make the hardware so simple and primitive that it gave the software a lot of control over it. And now the software had a lot of control over it, and the programmer had a lot of control over it. So if you were cagey and you bent over and grabbed your ankles, you could do some sneaky stuff with it.
I have a question. What was the Nolan Bushnell timing in all of this? Who up there actually worked with Nolan?
Not me.
And when did he leave? David, you were with Nolan at one point, weren't you?
Yes, I joined Atari again in 1977, and the 2600 was about to come out. I was being hired into the design group to do the programs. And Warner had already bought Atari. So Nolan was there, but Nolan was no longer in charge.
When did he leave?
No, that's a good question.
I think around 78, because that's when I started, and he was recently departed. His myth was still hanging around the halls, but not his persona.
Well, he was, chairman of the board or something. You know how it is when you are moving someone out on the corporate ladder. You move them out to the board and then move them off the board. So rather than having day-to-day operational responsibility as he had before that, he was the guy who just wandered around the lab and made suggestions. And it was actually, a very good position for him because he had a lot of great ideas and he loved to talk about them. And, we would go up to his newly acquired mansion up in Woodside and have, game strategy sessions and game brainstorming sessions and that sort of thing. And like I said, he would be wandering through the lab and just show me what you got, show me what's cool, and like to make suggestions.
Does that answer your question, Gary?
It did.
Well, I actually had a much more technical question, talking about video kernels and how the TIA graphics work. I was wondering about how there's a very small amount of ROM that's available initially, and also this limit of 4K in the address space. How did I'm interested in how bank switching came to be used in cartridges, and how was that something that was happening?
Well, you're considered handy if you went off to the other 4K group, but
We've always said you can do any game in 2K. You can do any game, and then of course you can do any game in 4K.
yeah. And then when they saw some of the title screens, they're like,
I can do a whole, use the whole top 4K for that.
right. Extra room, and I can change the game so game time's too a little longer to release and start getting into that space. But, what was the core of that question?
Well, I was wondering, like, did people when the design was finished, did they know, oh well, in the future we can just bank switch and use huge amounts of ROM, or was that just something that
they only thought they were going to do what Tang and Pong with them.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah, and ROMs were expensive.
Yeah.
I mean, we were putting these games out in 2K ROMs because that's all that we could afford. In other words, at that price, nobody would pay $80 for a video game. You can't pay $80 for a video game, really? No. But anyway, you look at the 4K addressing limitation, and this is a technical issue, and I don't know how many people are going to be interested in this, but I will try to answer your question. There is a 4K limit on the cartridge space because of the number of pins on the cartridge. And the reason the number of pins on the cartridge was 24 was because one of the engineers thought that was the standard and designed it in. Turns out 26 is the standard, was the industry standard at the time, and we could have had our phase 2 and our read-write line and had the exact same thing. But
6507, who did the address?
6507 has 8K addresses. And that was another thing, is if you want to keep your chip select circuitry really simple, you put all the ROM in the top half and all the hardware in the bottom half and use only one bit for chip select. You won't actually have any glue parts on the board. But that was the limitation because, oh my God, I mean, that's 4K addressing space. We won't be able to buy 4K ROMs for years, right? And of course, we all know how fast the ROM space grew for the cost. So bank switching wasn't even considered until you didn't think you could use or fit your game in 4K anymore. And that was about 83, 84, right?
Yeah, I was considering using 16K for Garfield. I believe that's right.
Anybody know what the first bank switch game was?
I want to say it's asteroids.
Asteroids.
I think it was Asteroids.
Yeah, it was Asteroids.
I think chess was designed with it, or at least
Yeah, that was a real expensive game. The guy that wrote it, he's the guy that did the baseball game that talked.
Yeah, oh, Warren, not Warren.
Lovely fellow, brilliant. But he did speech synthesis with the, you know, the noisemaker on the chip. He made speech.
Brad Stewart.
Brad Stewart. Brilliant fellow. Yeah, he did Asteroids, and he needed lots of ROM for that.
I remember the word foul, it's not the word foul.
So baseball was not released.
Not that one.
Oh, wait a minute.
Tell me why you need 8K to do an Asteroids game?
Think about it.
Well, I think he had massive bitmaps instead of actually moving sprites. He was doing massive bitmap loading as a way to get. Remember how many asteroids are on the screen at one time? You know how many sprites he got? Now, the Stella chip had 2 sprites, but you could flip a switch and get a pair. But they were just duplicate. They were just clones. Flip another switch, you got a triad, but they were just clones of each other. If you think of the Asteroids game, you got 11 unique items floating around the screen. So he was bitmapping like a son of a gun.
I let you split it.
Well, that was another way to get more items on the screen. He was multiplexing. Brad Stewart, great guy.
So obviously there's no agenda up here. We'll just leave. Oh, there we go, all right.
So since there's a limitation of 2 sprites plus duplicates, how did you handle the mini games that had, it would appear to the players, more than 2 moving objects on the screen at a time?
First, you design the game thinking about the limitation, and you work it out from there. But
I think it mostly derived from the 6-character score kernel that
everybody uses.
was the first time that we were able to get 6 digits up on the screen for the score, and then that evolved into moving objects in the game, and then if you change each object on the fly, you get multiple objects without working.
Well, it's actually simpler than that. It goes back before that, and you can reuse the vertical. Basically, you can have two like 8-bit objects and 3 1-bit objects on the screen at any one given time without using the repeating. But then as soon as they're done, since you're rewriting this program, as the TV is scanning down, you can say, oh, stop, reuse them. And so that you can reuse all the same objects. So, I mean, you look at a game like Freeway, and you've got the 2 chickens are actually sharing one of those that's replicated. That's why they can't move this way. They would move together if they had to. Okay. 2 chickens are in this row. And I've used this other one and put it up here, making it a pickup truck and then a semi, and you just move it around on the different lanes of graphics.
So you could reload your sprite later in the screen, but that meant that they couldn't pass each other vertically. So you had to occasionally design your gameplay so that they never had to. That was the whole doing a lot with a little. You design the gameplay within the limitations of the hardware.
And enough time to rewrite that sprite during the refresh.
You could rewrite it several times down the screen, move it, change its graphics, change its color. But it could not pass itself vertically.
It had to update just before it got wrong. That's usually an age point, but
Makes sense.
Was the figure terribly hard to translate to a home system?
Bob will say yes.
What were the major hurdles to get through to make it, you know, something you spend a lot of time in the arcade to play it and then go home and say, well, this is kind of cool too.
Well, since at the time Flickr was allowed, it was a bit difficult to have multiple objects. But the main hurdle was how to convert all those buttons into a joystick. So I had to come up with certain strategies on location rather than joystick. Like for the smart bomb, you look the ship down below the city. Smart bomb if you press the button.
The arcade game represented a serious design problem because an original game designed for the 2600, you could design it within the limitations of the machine. But marketing discovered they sold a lot more cartridges if you did a home version of Defender and Asteroids and Missile Attack. problem was those were arcade games. They were not designed with the limitations of the 2600 chip. So it became very clever people like Bob who had to figure out how to stretch the graphic capability of that little tiny chip to do what a game that was designed to run on a much bigger platform.
Yes. Still
The button problem was a major challenge, but the graphics was another big. You had to make creative decisions of what to let go of.
She was our first graphic artist. She was working on about 6 games at once. Nowadays, you got 20 artists per project, which is kind of sketchy. We had a black box.
And
Carry out when you're laid off.
yeah, and for debugging, we actually got to the stage where we actually had logic analyzers, so you'd actually have it clicked on the bus and actually see, and then we could code the signals that were on the bus and tell you what the code was that was actually running.
Yeah, AD logic analysis.
Yeah.
I never know how to use it, so I use it to hold my listing. Triangle.
It's kind of funny. It's funny to use those $20,000 logic analyzers for buttons and the 2600.
Well, the primary thing those were used for is to make sure that the frame rate was correct. That's what that $20,000 logic analyzer
Were there signals right off the TI chip you're watching?
It was actually everything microprocessor.
Yeah.
We had a good tracing.
I think I'm borrowing oscilloscope.
Well, we also always wrote our own debuggers. So the main development environment was a box. It's called the blue boxes and the black boxes or whatever. No. That in my day had a 2600 sitting on top of it and a cable running down to this box. And all it really was expanding the computer inside to have extra memory, extra RAM, extra ROM. And so since you had extra ROM, we could write debuggers. And that let us modify memory byte at a time, let us put in breakpoints and watch the code execute, stop the code, see what the registers were like. You have to have something like that, otherwise you're writing and guessing. I mean, you can't just write all your code and say, it doesn't work, I wonder why. So what you do is you set a breakpoint at the point where you're reading the joystick, because when you move the joystick to the right, the guy runs to the left. Well, you stop the code, you say, oh, I see. It's pretty easy to figure out once you have that.
Didn't Larry Miller write that card game by hand and hydraulic? No, it was Enduro, yeah.
I'm not sure about that. Al Miller used to write code in his easy chair at home, write on paper. And I mean, I would write a routine about 15 bytes and test it. I wonder if it's right. I wonder what I screwed up, Because you write thousands of lines of code and try to debug it. It takes days, But there were people who did that. And Larry Kaplan was another. He actually had this one thing that he wanted to do in his entire life is he wanted to have like a camera record the TV screen, one frame for every day of development, and then run a movie to watch how it grows, and it's kind of like a time-lapse thing. So he would he would go away for 3 days and write all his code and type it all in and turn it on, and it would be like, a godly mess. But he loved it. He thought that was the cool thing, So yeah, some people tried that. They tried writing a lot of lines of code. Certainly wasn't the way I worked.
Stargate, Bill Asperoni, for like 3 months, black screen. And he's sleeping in a sleeping bag, said he's working really hard. Everybody's like really wondering what's this guy doing. And then one morning, turns on the TV and says, hey, look what is this? I go, I couldn't believe I was blown away. The whole game, the whole game was running. And I was like, wow, you really did a good job. He just didn't have a kernel. 3 months. How everything's intertwined. So he just couldn't, there was no visible display that anybody could understand.
That reminds me of the discussion we had. We said, let's see if we can replace the video game thing. We got these really tiny little ROMs, only 2 KB, right? So let's make a machine that goes through every combination of the bits in 2K byte ROM. And then we'll have like 100 of them sitting here. And all the person has to do is he pushes a go or no go. Anybody in this room could say, that looks like a game, that's a black screen, you know. And then, yeah, and then you go through, and eventually you get some games that you pass on. You just pass it down this exponential, you know, list to where then you have game testers, and they're testing these things. You're like, this would be great.
Would the number be 2048 factorial?
It's 2 to the 2048. So if it took a half a second each, we figured out that it would take longer than since the last Big Bang.
So in the age of the universe, you could come up with...
In the age of the universe, you come up with one game.
One game.
But the funny thing about that is there would be trillions of games that were absolutely identical. Because when you're writing code, like, you've got two registers. You've got to put a 1 in register X and a 2 in register Y. Well, the order of that didn't matter. And in fact, in many cases, you could, so there's thousands and thousands of ways you could just do 2 or 3 lines, right? You know? And then they're not just lookalikes. I mean, they're not just similar. They are identical games in that particular case. So it could.
One of the interesting things about the Stella chip was the amount of RAM. Now, in your PC, you have what? Half a gig of RAM in your PC at home? On the Stella chip, 128 nipples. Bytes, okay. 100
cross over this.
the byte boundary.
Yeah.
128 bytes was the total RAM capacity to keep your score in there. And we're also using that RAM because we could load faster from RAM than you could from the ROM, so sometimes you use the RAM to preload your graphics and then on screen draw type, fire it out real quick. But 128 bytes of RAM, your watch is more powerful than that graphics chip.
Speaking of nibbles, that's where we stored most of our flags. You take 1 byte and you'd have 8 flags, and then you keep asking it more than one.
Well, the reason for that is you've got 128 bytes of RAM and 2K bytes of ROM. And when you're getting near the end of the game, you're out with one or the other. You're just flat out with one or the other. And you can trade off between them. Like what he's talking about is you can use a byte of RAM for your, well, no, something that's 1 bit. I mean, you know, for a 1-bit flag. And so if it's a 0, it means this. If it's a 1, it means that. Well, then there's a whole bunch of wasted bits. So instead, you just use 1 bit. And this bit over here means there's a tree on the screen. This bit over here means there's a, you know, this thing's already been shot, exploding or whatever. But that takes extra ROM because you have to read it and then isolate 1 bit. So there's always these cases where we're trying to trade off ROM versus RAM. They're both very limited. Yeah.
And if you ran out of RAM, you'd have to go rewrite your ROM to use less RAM.
Right. And what's worse is every game, typically, in a 2K byte ROM, is about 2,500 bytes by the time you're done putting all the features. I'm serious. So basically, the last month, you're sitting there poring over this code and saying, I can save a byte. You figure out a way to rewrite this entire routine to have 1 less byte. So now it's only 490 minutes. And you rewrite it, and you rewrite it, and you, hundreds of times, you rewrite this code. And each time figuring out ways, I mean, the tricks that we have in there, there are scary things. Bob Whitehead, for example, he had a table of graphics. And the first byte in the table was 60 hexadecimal. Right? It just happened to be that was the top of the head of the character was a 60 hex. Well, 60 happens to be the opcode for a return from subroutine. So if you put a subroutine above that table, and you didn't put the return from subroutine command in, he fell through and used the byte 60 as a subroutine return. He saved a byte right there. Hundreds of those things. It was insane.
Howard Washoe, with his Yours and Bench, he said he used graphics table, his code as graphics table for examination. So he used the code as graphic images.
Yeah, use that reset.
So I was going to say that using the background was a pretty common thing, so one of my games I had that too. But if you actually got some code that was partially a table of like zeros, all of a sudden your graphics, your background, they have this block that was all the same color. So you have to like go find some other place in the code that looked interesting graphically.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, I was just going to ask. It seems that the ROM limitations was kind of a much stronger constraint than the RAM limitations, even though 128 bytes sounds like not very much to us right now. I just wondered, is that the case? Did you find that you often had as much RAM as you wanted, but it was really ROM that was constrained?
So the question was,
Well, the RAM limitation wasn't as bad as the ROM limitation.
because he's thinking, well, you need a couple digits to score, you know. But what you actually did is there were games you could not do because you didn't have enough RAM. An example would be anything that didn't have it. Anything where you had to keep, data, bitmap information, you just flat out didn't do that. You designed the game to not need it. So from that standpoint, again, certainly if you design carefully enough, you can say, well, I did it so I don't need RAM. But it was as big a concern.
I was wondering if you guys think that you could have done Pac-Man better.
That was a 2K, right?
Yeah.
Oh, I don't think that.
Was it 4?
It didn't matter. It was in 6 weeks. The biggest problem with Pac-Man was the schedule. There have been a number of games. E.T. has a really bad reputation, but, E.T. has a lot of justification for the way it came out. And in my business today, we deal with clients all the time. We do casual games and advertising sponsors and that sort of thing. And a lot of clients come in and say, man, we want to do this such and such a game. And we have this huge promotion coming, so it's got to be done on August 1st. And we look at the schedule, we count it up and said, yeah, if we started today, we can finish on August 1st, it's fine. Then there's a month contract negotiation, then there's a month getting materials from them. And you lose 3 months, and they look at you and say, okay, August 1st, right? And you have no choice because there's all this other stuff that's all tied into it. Well, that's what happened with E.T. They basically said, here's this license, we're going to get a fortune for this license, we've got to have a game. They flew, it was Howard, right?
Yeah, Howard.
They flew Howard down to, meet with Spielberg and all this kind of stuff. And then they said, and you got 6 weeks.
And he got fed under the door.
That's right. And Pac-Man was the exact same thing. Huge license, we're betting the company on it, and you've got 6 weeks to do it. Certainly, give it more time. The biggest problem I think with Pac-Man is it's the age-old problem of trying to squeeze an arcade game into the 2600. The display, the hardware, it's basically this bitmap of dots. Remember what I said about bitmaps and RAM? And but the intelligence of the ghosts could have more accurately represented Pac-Man if there had just been time to write the code.
Yeah.
Amazing
job with it though.
Did that in 4K and this Pac-Man came out later, was at least 8, so that's.
It was 8, and plus we had, years of our knowledge base to take advantage of, so. But I still think it was a great effort. My direction was, hey, keep those quicker.
My favorite movie marketing story was I was called into corporate headquarters once. There was a lady there from some Hollywood production company with her slide projector pitching a new movie that was in production, would be out in 6 months, and they wanted to license the movie for a video game before the movie ever came out. We sent it into development centers. So I was asked to come and opine as to whether this movie would make a good candidate for a video game. So I listened to the presentation about this archaeologist that's running through the jungle looking for the lost ark, and I said, nah. this new guy, Spielberg, who'd ever heard of him? No. So we passed. Now, in all fairness, this was before everybody knew that it would be a hit blockbuster movie. Listening to a pitch like that, you don't know. Nevertheless, I was not asked again about future films.
Have either any of you seen this television show that's on the G4 station called Code Monkeys? You heard about this?
I think it showed me. I couldn't get past 8 minutes of it.
It was some of the
No, I don't know if anybody's working on that stuff.
It's about you. A lot of history of the actual video game situation. A lot of history in there, little in-joke that people who don't necessarily know the history would get. You know, the owner who knows nothing about video games and just bought the company from Texas gets pays Spielberg $20 million, and Spielberg says, "You said $30 million." He's like, "No, I said $20 million." And then he's like, "Okay, guys, the game has to be finished by tomorrow." And the game, you know, has problems, and they're trying to, they don't do it hard.
It's like a cartoon.
Oh yeah, it's cartoon, but it's an 8-bit graphics style video game.
Yeah.
And very into that episode, they decide to they just store all the cartridges in the Indiana Jones type ending.
That's good.
Kind of funny.
They didn't bury the landfill, did they?
No.
When you're creating an original game, have any of you halfway through work think, okay, this is impossible, there's no way my idea is going to translate to the total game? Has there ever happened to you?
I would keep forcing it to go. I would go as long as I could.
Yeah. You'd have to say it a little differently. I've never seen a situation where you say, my idea can't fit because you change it every day. I mean, everything is massaged. But I've run games completely out to completely finished code and played and said, no, it's still not fun. Sorry, it's just not fun. You almost want to see it through just to, to quote the end, and then hopefully by that time it'll be fun. But I'm sure there are people that go halfway into it and mentally can it on their own, just on the edge. And there are people the opposite who finish the game is no fun until they still sell it.
I want to say there's one other sort of a flip side of that too. Sometimes there are people that came up with an interesting effect, and it's like it looks so interesting that they wanted to make something around it too. So sometimes you didn't have the limitation because you already, the solution to the limitations was kind of what they used as the heart and soul of the game too. So there's that.
That wasn't all that rare either. I mean, you finish a game and then you're looking around for inspiration. And sometimes what you would do is just sit there and hack on the 2600 and say, what can I make it do now? I mean, the 6-digit store kernel was, it was almost a miracle that it actually happened. And it wouldn't have happened without detail, of course, and that's a different story. It's one little thing they put in the hardware at the end because it made combat look a little better. It made it look like it was moving better up and down. This whole thing vertical delay. It turns out that you had to use that to use most of the tricks we used thereafter.
Yeah, it's still, I never really knew
Well, that could be a good question.
Yeah.
Basically, as we've said, you're writing this program that is synchronous with the TV screen as it's scanning. And there are only 76 computer cycles, and that's about 20 instructions, and you can only do so much in 20 instructions. Well, what often happened, as it did with Tank and the early games, is they said, well, wait a minute, if we have 40 instructions to work with, we can just treat 2 scan lines as one. So we only change the graphics every 2 scan lines. That gives us 40 instructions thereabouts to calculate what goes on next and all that kind of stuff. We call it a 2-line kernel. So basically, the graphics are, if you looked at them really closely, they only step every 2 scan lines. So there you go.
Half-res, vertical.
Yeah,
You
exactly.
get that anyway if you wrote the 77th machine cycle, you get a square weight set and
Yeah, you would waste the entire line if you want.
Blew over the line.
But you wouldn't want that because the better graphics would be full resolution. But anyway, so the reason there were 2-line kernels is because you have 2 tanks. And so yes, in one scan line you can do all the calculations you need to output one tank, and now you got to do the other player's tank. So typically what would happen is you do all that calculation on one line for your first tank, and all that calculation on your second line for the other tank. If you look really closely, the tanks were like this. One line, this one's one line down from that one because it got written one scan line later, okay? And what VDEL did, very simply, is it says don't display this one until that one is written again. So you've actually stored it in there, but don't display it. And so only when the first one is written does the second one change. So all of a sudden now, they move 2 line ticks up and down, but they're not staggered by that. So there was actually a 1-bit delay line built into the hardware called Wright. Yeah, now you know what VDEL does. And then that obscure thing came up because there were no questions at the time. So ask a question. That's Steve, you're in charge.
Oh, but that went on to be used, that 6-character kernel scheme stretched out in games like 5.5, right, for the road team.
Well, that was,
But it's
yeah.
very simple.
Oh, we use it, that's the all the time.
In the Atari 800, well, that series of computers, we used to write like tons of code in the vertical sync, the time it took the cathode ray to get from the lower right back up to the upper left. Did you have that capability in the 2600?
Yeah, that's where the most
Everything.
logic is at.
Everything.
The whole game was
Yeah, that's good code.
Yeah.
During the screen time, your kernel was writing the screen
The
with
microprocessor was busy doing the screen.
Yeah. So the only time you had for game logic scorekeeping, blah, 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 was during that vertical interval. What, 22 scan lines?
And that's screen length you could actually set. You had the program had control over that. That's why you know.
So some games that had a lot more calculations had a smaller screen size.
Yeah, that's the first thing I do is whack off the bottom part.
Yeah. Letterbox game like this.
And some games didn't have the right number of lines, so they rolled when you turn them on. They were out of sync.
So the logic analyzer.
Yeah, but some companies released games that had the wrong number of lines.
We weren't on it all.
No, not everybody.
Yeah. What is your biggest regrets, I guess, programming-wise? Like when you look back and you said, I could have done it a little bit differently with a certain game, or just, is there like a one, like, just for each one of you, I guess?
I wish I would have written faster so I could have done it. Really, you know, when I look back at all this, and it was only like 2.5 year window for me. Sounds like it's same for Dave, wrote a lot of stuff. But just for me, it was just kind of I don't know, understanding how, and you can only do this in retrospect, how precious that time was to try to figure out what's the best way to maximize the stuff. I mean, I think I did at the time, but it was just having so much fun. Never did feel like it worked for me. So,
In my game, I regretted not going to more sophisticated graphics. When I wrote my game at Atari, we were right just after the combats and, you know, the adventure games. And so blocky graphics was the norm at that time. And so my soccer game had kind of blocky graphics. Kicky gameplay, but blocky graphics. Shortly after that, Activision exploded in our face. And what their strength was kicky graphics. Okay, they put the emphasis on the correct syllable. Okay, and the marketing department at Atari went ballistic. Why are Activision games so much better than ours? Well, they actually, first of all, they skimmed off the cream of the crop, but the emphasis on the game design was on the graphic appearance of the game. And so we had to up our ante to make our kernels tighter, fancier, sexier, more colorful, lower finer resolution.
Yeah, because of that, we had to come up with a round wall.
Yeah. Yeah. They could do it, but they're really awful.
For Dave Crane, and maybe anybody else might have an opinion as well, but David, you said you've written a lot of games, and you've also indicated you're really concerned with the playability of your games. I'd just like to know, of all the games you've written, which 5 do you consider to be the best?
Well, obviously, it's a hard question to answer, particularly, I mean, take 68 games, how would you find 5 out of that anyway? Oh, yeah, Gary was telling the story.
Oh, the lost gem.
It's a lot easier to find the worst 5. You know, I did most of my games, as we mentioned earlier, in the vein of what cool thing can I do with the 2600? And there are a lot of cool things. I mean, we keep talking about the 6-digit score kernel, and the 6-digit score kernel was a very difficult thing in advance, and all it really did, in most cases, for several years, is it let us have 6 digits of score. I mean, you saw it in laser blast, and 0, 0, 0. 6 digits of score. I mean, that's all it gave us. But when I did Dragster, I had to take that 6-digit score kernel and make it move. So, if you remember, we're talking about how the program is synchronous to the sweep of the videos. And you're writing these things, they are happening on the exact instant in time, or else the first digit is only half a digit. You know, this has to happen. Well, the dragster took that same technology, and instead of using numbers and digits, it used graphics of a drag racer. And that had to move across the screen. So the code that is writing the dragster is similar to the 6-digit score kernel, but it is running synchronous with a moving object, I guess is the only way to put it. Instead, it's already tricky, but we're synchronizing to something that's moving along at 15,750 hertz. Now we're moving it, we're moving the target upon which those writes have to actually occur in the microprocessor. Grand Prix. Grand Prix, I have no idea what I had to go through to put that big Grand Prix bar on the screen. And if it wasn't bad enough to put it on the screen, it had to scroll on the screen and it had to scroll off the screen. So if you look at that object, it's made up of one of those sprites, and it's using one of its wide formats and double formats. It uses doubles for the tires and wide for the body and double for the tires. The colors are all done. Wheels are turning, you know, all this stuff is going on. And when you start to move it off the screen, what you might not realize with the 2600 is if you put an object on the right edge of the screen and you move it 1 pixel, that pixel shows up on the left side of the screen, right? So basically the drag racer in Dragster is 32 different drag racers. One for every 8 bits of its width going off the screen, one for every 8 bits of its width going on the screen, and each one of them has to be custom drawn. It's not just like you draw the picture. Each one of them has to manipulate the hardware in a certain way to make it all happen. And you do it as each. But that's the thing is, you know, the things we were doing back then, they were fun puzzles, they were really great. But it was like, you could count on, well, there were less than 50 people in the entire world who have any idea what you were doing when they looked at these games. Otherwise, as a player, you said, oh, that's cool. Drag racer, Grand Prix card is off the screen.
Did you literally draw that?
Oh, I had paper. Every one of those 32 guys, actually there's times 3 because the tires turn in three different animations. So for everything I did, times 3, just to make the little dots on the tire and that's how it's wrong. We learned one really cool thing is you need 3 graphics to animate. Just always remember that, you need 3. If you have 2, it might be flipping forwards or backwards, but you have always do 3 and you make it so that the first one matches the third one, so it's the same shit to maintain
Innovation second.
Exactly.
One of the cool things that Stella Chip did have that was incredibly far-reaching is it had hardware collision detect. Extremely important because you had to all the time determine whether this thing had collided with a ball had struck. And if you had to do that in software, you would be spending an awful lot of your cycles in your code trying to do your collision detect in software. So that was a real look ahead thing. Hardware collision detect.
We got this guy back.
Okay, crazy. Okay, my question is, I mean, you look back at the history of Atari, and they made just Time Warner made one horrible mistake after another, just spending and wasting money and doing things last minute. My experience is the programmers usually know what's really happening. What was the programmers' feelings on management during all this time when Time Warner was just squandering money and making one bad mistake after another?
We need more licenses. That's what I was saying all the time. But I don't know what they were doing.
We're going to take the blame. We take the blame. We didn't listen to them. You take the Atari 800 computer, for example. The Atari 800 computer was project management was fully behind. We're going to make the first small business computer ever made. Engineering department is back and says, we're making the best video games ever. Okay, I don't care if you call it a home computer, put a keyboard on it, whatever you want. We're making video games. And I swear, all the way up to the VP of engineering, it was think whatever you want, and you isolated the design and said, let's just make a real cool video game. And so we ended up making this really cool video game, and they marketed it as a computer, and eventually, I guess, they built a floppy disk and a printer or whatever to make it try to be kind of business-like. But really, as it got, it was just a cool computer.
It should put a basic out on it.
Well, in fact, it did.
Put out of the gate.
Then they came up with the 5200, which was the 800 in a different packaging?
Yeah.
I have a question of curiosity. I came in kind of late, so I don't know if it's already been asked, but do any of you ever plan to make more games for the 2600? I know there's kind of a fairly decent homebrew scene and having some of the veteran masters doing it as a hobby or for the heck of it.
Yeah, Atari2600.com, which has a booth here, keeps coming up with new products somehow for the 2600. Getting us
Well, turns out they're also doing, at some point, some 5200 stuff. So some folks from the Atari Historical Society got a hold of some of our old backup tapes, and especially the games that we were working on when the Tremels bought us and they were never finished. And so I had people from the Historical Society that were calling me and saying, so, how can we finish this thing? And it turns out that I was hoping to have something to announce here about Tempest for the 5200, but that's still coming.
So that's a free now.
Yeah. And to Claire. One of the really neat things about actually looking at that code again is it helps bring back what these guys are going through. Because when we were doing all that assembly language stuff, and when David's talking about how we're trying to save bits of code, I would rearrange places in my code where I was putting a number 1 in some register. I didn't want to have to load another 1 again someplace. You arrange your code so you can transfer the Y register to the accumulator. So you shift your code to say 1 byte and all this stuff.
Or even better, there's already a 0 in the accumulator. I don't have to put it in anymore. But then you move code around now. It's 27 in the accumulator.
And you're locked, yes. So debugging this stuff is horrible. So actually, when we're talking about debugging, I wanted to tell you one other debugging trick you can do. So if you didn't have to write a whole routine, one of the tricks you do is, if I get this result, turn this thing orange or blue. And so you kind of look at what color it was, because you can get things on the screen. So you play tricks like that, so you didn't have to actually step through your code or whatever.
I had a question about the 5200 baseball. That's
mine.
Yeah, yours. I know that Jim Andreessen started it, and you finished it. Was there anything left of Jim Andreessen, or did you really pretty much do that all on your own?
Actually, that is a good story. So Jim had just done real sports football. So on the back up, even one more step back from that. A lot of what Atari did was reactive mode. When Activision started having better graphics, we had to have better graphics. When television was selling sports games, we had to make better sports games. So Jim had just been put under the pressure cooker to make real sports football, and had just done that, and went right off going to real sports baseball. And so he just got burned out, and so they put me on that. And I always tend to want to have things the way they were, so I pretty much started over again because I want to have better graphics and stuff like that, less blocky and stuff like that. But it turns out that because I wanted to do all that writing, it took me way longer than they wanted, and Jim did his vacation, came back, and actually put in the computer logic for our gameplay. And so he's still listed first, because we always listed me as Keithen. So we couldn't have a Keithen and Jim Andreessen, so Jim gets listed first. So I think that's like the right thing, because he started working on it first.
Was his talking?
No.
Did it didn't talk?
No. So this is another thing where we had consultants, Larry Carr and Andy Barber, that had done things, and they had this real cheap voice stuff that if, as you took every scan line, you could take a little bit of code and go grab some data and stuff it into your speaker volume. And so they had this way of making sound and digitized things. And so they had this thing that they wanted someone to use. And I wanted to put the voice into baseball, mainly because they gave me like an extra 8K for the data. And it's like, well, we compressed the sound into like 4, so I got extra 4K of gameplay logic and stuff. So I just want the extra ROM space.
We have time for about 2 more questions.
react to Clinton consultant because you're working with us intensely on this. I mean, I find the whole rivalry kind of fascinating, especially at the expo where the strong as hard as targets. Do you guys like live it about those, or just that's what I want to see that.
Well, so I guess I mentioned the sports angle, that there was the competition and stuff like that. So the one thing I'll say for me personally was, I always wanted to write the best things I could. So when it meant someone else was beating us up for graphics and that meant all of a sudden the thing I was interested in had more value too. I did not regret them doing any work on what we did. Activision, I got to tell you, the guys that did Activision gave us more freedom than anything else, for instance, because of all of the stuff they did.
Yeah, because you guys got as long as freedom.
Yeah, more over the land.
They raised the bar. Yeah, you know, when they left and they did what they did, such a high caliber work.
Yeah, they had all the offices.
And I think the manager respected us more when they went off. They did, obviously, what we wanted. I mean, it was a good thing.
Yeah, they would come up with some new graphics tool that we would say, well, you can't do that unless you get one grant. And it's okay, here you go. I said, oh, no, then we got to figure it out.
So overall, anybody's trying to build a collection of games what you're starting now, what would you say is probably all of you, like 4 or 5 the ones that have the most replayability and addictiveness, if you want to call it that?
I'm not going to hear that question. Everything is personal taste.
Yeah. It depends when you ask it too, you know, it's like, what song do you feel like those are?
What's your personal taste?
At this point right here. I like River Raid and Action Sequence.
I always like the RC battle because you can move the missile in real time. Yeah, and it felt really good to play.
I don't know.
I'll give you one that I think is a kind of something for square blocking graphics. Warlord was kind of fun for getting multiple people to do things. Not great graphics, but gameplay.
It's the Tetris thing. It's a good game.
I like Terminal. Down. Tempos horizontal. Yeah.
All right, I'm going to go with the 5200 version of Hayenga.
You see the choices? That was amazing.
Sit down.
Yeah, it's
It's hard to find, but it was to be.
Thank you very much.